So our next speaker is Bobette Jones from the Aspen National Forest, and she'll be speaking to us about cattle selection for Aspen and Meadow Forage, implications for restoration.
I have to check this. Okay, is that good for everyone? All right. So I work on the Aspen National Forest where we conducted this project, and I want to recognize working with UC Davis as well. I did this for my dissertation, and also working with UC Cooperative Extension, so Penn State Davis and David Lile. Where we're located is in Northeast California on the Lassen. I work at, the study was on the Eagle Lake Ranger District, and Aspen's a little bit of a different beast in this area. It's very scattered throughout our landscape. Our stands tend to be small. Most of our stands are less than an acre. And it comprises about 1% of our landscape. As we see in most of the areas in, the Western United States, we see that there's been a decline in aspen. And most of our aspen stands, we did an inventory. We found that they're at a high risk of being lost. And so that means that they're either overtopped by conifers and being shaded out, or being not regenerating successfully. And this can either be due to shading and or grazing or browsing. And so we use the principles of the aspen regeneration triangle, trying to address the three components: the site, apical dominance, and also protection. So when we look at those, we found that almost all of our stands have conifer encroachment, and then about 50% have excessive browsing. And in this area, we have also deer use and also livestock use, and the amount of browse it ranges from light to heavy. And what this area on the Lassen where we're conducting this study is the summer range for deer. So we don't have a really bad problem with deer, except where we have fawning areas. And as you know, we're all overlapping a little, but it's really important if we're looking at restoration and increasing regen, is that we allow these suckers to incrementally grow and eventually get above the browse line. And so this is a really good indication of what we have very small stands, and then most of our overstory is decadent. You can see here that the overstory has fallen over, and so it's very important in these stands to really get this next cohort above the browse line. So our most popular tool is fencing, and here's a livestock. And this is an area we know it's successful. You can see a fence in the background. You can see all their good regen, and then all the related issues. Bob covered this well: cost, aesthetics, and responsibility is a big one. And if we were to fence all of our stands that needed fencing, just the cost to build is about $600,000. So this really instigates really trying to address where we have livestock. Can we develop livestock raising strategies to protect aspen as an alternative to fencing? So we wanted to look at and quantify the seasonal changes in forage quality, looking at the among three veg types, looking at the meadow herbaceous community, the aspen understory herbaceous community, and the aspen regen itself. We were also looking at the amount of forage available, so we measured seasonal biomass changes in the two herbaceous communities. And then we're looking at the amount of use in these three vegetation types throughout the grazing season. So we used our aspen inventory to randomly select our sites. And this is an example of what we're looking for. We're looking at aspen meadow complexes where because our stands are so small and they're adjacent to an attractant, or where we have our dominant forage, which is in the meadows in these systems, it's a really good concentration area for cattle to come into these aspen stands. So that's why we chose this as our site selections. We were also able to identify stands that had very low deer use. We tried to pick stands that were relatively healthy, so they had very little conifer encroachment. And then we were trying to capture the gradient of browsing intensity that we see on our district. So we had three categories: light, which was less than 20% utilization on the aspen, and then moderate, which is 20 to 50, and then heavy use we considered over 50% browse. These were the 6 study sites that got selected, and you can see they're nicely distributed throughout our district. The green is the aspen that occurs on our our sites, and then the red is our study site. So we collected data across 2 years in 2006 and 2007. And then we, calculate the amount of biomass, we used the comparative paired plot method, comparative yield method, sorry. And then around those cages in our plots, we just collected forage samples, and we measured protein, acid detergent fiber, phosphorus, calcium, and the water contents. We had 2 very different precip years. In 2006, it was a very wet year, and in 2007, we got the very dry year. And so we just adjusted our collection dates for early, mid, and late season based on plant phenology. So we're in a Mediterranean system, so plants start to senesce, so our early, mid, and late might not match up to Edward's. I'm going to blase through that, but I can, anyone that's interested, I can get into all these specific interactions. Just look at the graphs of this data. We'll start with forage quality. One trend we'll see for all of our forage quality is that as the season advances, we see a decline in forage quality in all the vegetation types, but Aspen always has higher forage quality compared to our 2 herbaceous vegetation types. The red lines are indicating the minimum nutritional requirement for lactating cows, which is the type of cattle we're running on these allotments. And you can see that in the early season, crude protein is above that nutritional quality. By mid-season, it drops and meets just the minimum requirement for cattle in the herbaceous communities, while Aspen's staying above it. And by late season, Aspen is the only forage type that is above the minimum forage nutrient requirement. So again, we see that same pattern for phosphorus, a decline in all veg types. Aspen's always higher, and by late season, the herbaceous communities are no longer meeting the requirement. Calcium was the only forage nutrient we measured that broke this pattern, and it increased throughout the growing season. However, I've put this in here just to, the calcium to phosphorus ratio is important. And so phosphorus is actually locked up by late season because that ratio is exceeding 7:1 in the Aspen. When we look at acid detergent fiber, increasing values are showing decrease in forage quality. You can see that the acid detergent fiber is staying relatively consistent levels throughout the grazing season in Aspen region, while it's increasing for the 2 herbaceous veg types. And this differential really is affecting the digestibility of forage. So as the season advances, when the cattle are taking in this dry matter, it's really not providing enough energy. It's just, it has a lot of lignin in it because most of our plants have senesced by this time, and cattle aren't able to digest it. And so then we also measured water content. We did this only 1 year. I think we've seen similar information. Again, water content's declining in the herbaceous forage. We're in a Mediterranean climate, so this makes a lot of sense. And it stays relatively high and consistent for the Aspen region. So not only do we have higher, Aspen meeting the nutrient requirements, but because of this water content, it's much more palatable for the livestock. When we switched to looking at the amount of forage available, we measured biomass in the 2 herbaceous communities. We see that there's an overall decline in biomass as the season advances. Meadows are providing the most forage in this area, but we saw a strong year difference in that wet year. We have a lot of forage available in the meadows, and they're pretty similar in the Aspen understory. So these drought years can really influence what cows are doing. And so when we want to look at, what is the cow eating and when, we can see that in all forage types, use increases in all 3 forage types. However, in the herbaceous forage types, you see an incremental increase in use in the late season, where we see that an exponential increase by late season in the Aspen region. And Bob had a great picture of this as well. When they switch to Aspen, they tend to just go full force and really start to utilize it heavily, and that's when we see that excessive browsing in the late season. So taking all this quantity and quality, you can see, we saw that the forage is decreasing in all veg types, but it's always higher in aspen. And because aspen are so small in this landscape, and they're providing this higher forage quality, it's really an attractive for cows. In the meadow and aspen understory, the quality and quantity are at their lowest in the late season, and forage quality is then dropping below the nutrient density requirements by late season. There's higher use in the aspen trees from mid to late season compared to the other two herbaceous forage types. And so from this, we can really, it comes down to timing. Timing of browse is important. And it's in the mid-season that we see the cows start to widen their forage selection and turn to the aspen trees themselves. And from a previous study, we found that mid-season browsing actually has the most negative effect on individual aspen tree growth. So this is a season we really want to try to avoid browsing on aspen in this system. And we have to consider both not only quality but quantity. And so as that herbaceous forage biomass decreases in the meadow and the aspen understory, and it's also meeting the minimum requirements for the cow's forage or nutrient demands, they will widen their forage selection, and that's what's resulting in that excessive browsing in aspen by late season. And so we can boil this down to just a few recommendations. We all know to think about the amount of forage, out there, the quality of that forage, but we also have to consider the cow nutrient demand in these different seasons. And we have lactating females, which have a higher nutrient demand, so that's one alternative you could address in some of these systems. But we can also think about trying to use a supplement program and to meet the crude protein or phosphorus demands of these livestock instead of allowing aspen trees to provide those nutrients. We want to try to avoid mid and late season grazing in consecutive years. So if we could just get incremental increases by allowing rest, like you can do early season grazing because we saw that cows don't really utilize aspen during that time. We can eventually allow the aspen to get above the browse line. We saw that biomass was very different according to year, and that it's providing the dominant forage out there. And so we need to set stocking rates so that there's enough forage available to the livestock and they're not widening their searches and utilizing aspen. And then I sort of jumped the gun there, but precipitation, our annual variation of precipitation is important. So we have to adjust those stocking rates in drier years so that there's enough forage available. All that work came down to those few recommendations, but we think if we can just start to use these as alternatives and through time, it's very important where we're trying to restore aspen to try to get them to have that incremental growth and get that successful regen. And I went fast, so we have time for questions.
Yeah, questions.
Yeah, so you went to sites that didn't have a lot of deer grass. And where I come from, we have some very heavy livestock and elk use.
Yeah.
And so we've had to almost by default go with fencing because we're finding that the elk are taking out the aspen even before the livestock are turned out on the range. And then in the later season, we're having livestock move into those sites again. Any suggestions? Obviously, we may be able to handle some of the livestock concerns, but are we kind of restricted to fencing, or as you suggested, the large scale conifer removal to try to dissipate some of that locust pressure?
Yeah. That's why I think it's important to save money aside where we can't control the animal to address the wildlife excessive browsing issues. I don't know if fencing is your only alternative. I think people have gotten very creative with using the conifers on sites and trying to use barriers, any kind of deterrent. But yeah, I think that fencing is going to be your only successful mechanism or management tool where you have wildlife browsing issues that intense. So I don't work with the wildlife as much. So. No, you want to say that?
You said that you're in a Mediterranean climate, and the patches of aspen are an acre
I think it just in some areas. I mean, we have two types of large stands. They're just not very common. We have stringers that are following the riparian zones, and then up higher on our mountains where we have, it's a very volcanic area, but they really expand on these rocky outcrops and can get quite large. But we don't have a conflict with grazing in the larger stands. See, I cut you guys up.
Excellent information. World of variability out there. Great. Well, it's our pleasure right now to hear our facilitator, Ava Strand, give a presentation. And Ava is at the University of Idaho, Moscow, and will be giving a presentation called Long-Term Monitoring of Aspen within the Upper Columbia Basin Network.